Beautiful Country is a coming-of-age story set in modern-day China, centering on the friendship between an American and a Chinese boy who met while training with Beijing's junior national tennis team. A big-hearted debut, Beautiful Country explores a friendship against the backdrop of a quickly changing country. J.R. Thornton graduated from Harvard in 2014, where he studied history, English, and Chinese. An internationally ranked junior tennis player, he later competed for the Harvard men's team and on the professional circuit. As a teenager, he lived in Beijing and will return to China in the fall of 2016 as a member of the inaugural class of Schwarzman Scholars. Beautiful Country is his debut novel. Let's give him a big Books and Books welcome, J.R. Thornton.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many people here. So, the book. So, this book came out of experiences I had living in China as a 14-year-old. I spent a year there training with a Chinese junior national team within the sort of state-run sports system. And the experiences I had there and sort of the relationships I developed with the kids or my teammates really stuck with me throughout my life and just had a huge impact on me when I came back to the U.S. And so as a kid who loved creative writing, I sort of kept going with it throughout high school, and by the time I got to senior year, I'd taken all the creative writing courses my school offered, and they said that if I wanted to sort of keep going creative writing, I'd have to do an independent study. They said that means you're going to have to write a play or a novel. And I said, hang on, maybe not. But I had an English teacher who told me that if I turned in a chapter a month, that he'd give me an A for the course. And I had not done very well in science the year before, so I was in need of an A. Yeah, he said nothing about it having to be a good chapter. So I was like, you got a deal. And so that's how this started. And by the end of sort of that school year, I had a kind of working draft. And in sort of deciding what I was going to write a novel about, it seemed this was sort of the biggest, sort of most impactful experience I'd had at that point in my life. And I felt like the story that I tell in Beautiful Country, one that you don't hear a lot about in the media here. When I came back from China, I felt like everything I read about China was showing this very one-dimensional, sort of monolithic view of China, where it's either, basically the story was their economy's growing really fast, and either that makes it a really exciting place to be, or that's somehow scary and threatening to the U.S. And to me, that really didn't get into sort of the complexities of the country, where still hundreds of millions of people live below the poverty line, and the sort of life experiences of a wealthy person in Beijing compared with someone who lives in Xinjiang province or in Guangzhou are just completely different. And with sort of the recent focus on China because of the Olympics, I felt sort of like the athletic system was one area that really wasn't being talked about, and so that's sort of how I decided to write this book, and also to get an A. But so I thought I'd read a few passages from the book. This first one is the two main characters in the book. The narrator is called Chase. He's American. And the sort of protagonist is this kid called Bowen, who's an exceptionally talented Chinese tennis player who's lying about his age by a year when the book starts. So he's really 15, but he tells people he's 14. And that was something that I experienced in the system. All my teammates were a year or two older than they actually. They claimed to be a year or two younger than they actually were, because the system was just so competitive. And these kids would practice sort of 8 hours a day. They wouldn't really go to school. They'd been in the system since they were 6, 7 years old. They paid a salary by the government, and basically the best ones would keep going through the system, and the worst ones would get cut. And it's just a pyramid system to the top. And the end goal is sort of to get to the men's national team maybe you make it on the pro tour, maybe you win a gold medal for China. That's like the ultimate dream. And but for the kids who don't make it through the system and get cut halfway through, it's a really tough spot to be left in because you have no real education, no real skill set other than being able to play tennis. So really the only option they had was, or the best option in some ways, would be to become a coach within the system. So this is a passage about the university system in China, and sort of gives context to the sort of situation that the kids on the team were in. I wondered if Bowen had ever thought about trying to go to university. I asked him that one day. He shook his head and explained to me he would never pass the Gaokao, the university entrance exam. The Gaokao was made up of 4 sections that Bowen described as 3 plus X. The 3 are Chinese, math, and English. Every single high school student is required to speak English well enough to pass a rigorous exam in English. The X is an exam that tests subjects a student feels he or she is strongest in. Bowen said that every year almost 10 million students took the Gaokao. There was no way he could take it now, having been out of the school system for so long. Even the smartest students at the best schools in the country would study from 5 a.m. to midnight every day for an entire year to prepare for the test. Bowen said that at the best universities, Tsinghua and Beida, they only accepted the top 8 students out of every 10,000 who took the exam. I was quiet for a moment while I thought about what he had just said. The 10 million number was simply staggering. The year before, when I had almost flunked out of school, my father, in an attempt to make me pick up my grades, had impressed upon me the fact that Yale only accepted a little more than 2,000 of the 30,000 people who applied every year. That gave it an acceptance rate of about 7%. According to Bowen, Tsinghua accepted only 24 out of 30,000. Their acceptance rate was closer to 0.07%. Later on during the year, as the Gaokao got closer, I would read stories in the China Daily of parents who had their children prepare for the test by studying and living full-time in hospitals, hooked up to IV drips and oxygen to improve their concentration. Victoria told me that during the 2 weeks before the Gaokao, cities all across China became deathly quiet at night as bars and clubs were shut down, and special noise ordinances passed so that the students could study in peace. I also read of students who committed suicide, of elaborate cheating scams that used wireless earphones, camera pens, and signal-emitting watches, and of girls who took hormone injections to delay their periods until after the exam. In America, I had heard of students going to the bathroom during the SAT and reading cheat sheets they had stashed in their pockets, but I'd never heard anything as drastic as any of this. To many, the Gaokao was a route out of poverty, and there was a competitiveness to every facet of life here that simply didn't exist in America. The boys on the tennis team had long dropped off the academic track necessary to be eligible even to take those exams. Their futures had been gambled on a game. I thought about Bowen's answer, about how he had absolutely no chance of going to university in China. But what if he got injured? A thought came to me. What if the next few years he prepared for the SAT or the TOEFL? As long as he could get a semi-decent score, I was sure he could get a scholarship to school in the States. And then I'm just going to read one more passage from the end of the book. Without giving too much away about the ending, Chase basically comes across Bowen several years after they're in Beijing together, and he runs across him at the Orange Bowl, which is actually in Coral Gables, at the Biltmore, which is, for people who don't know anything about tennis, it's sort of the top international under-18 tournament in the world. If you win the Orange Bowl, you're going to get a contract with Nike, and you're on basically everyone in the top 10 in the world professionals was, semis or finals at Orange Bowl. That's sort of how high the level is. And so Chase comes across him several years after being in Beijing, and he notices that Bowen's playing in the 14 underage division. At this point, Bowen's probably 17, but he's playing against 14-year-olds. And in tennis, that's a huge age gap because, 18, 17-year-olds, they're 6 foot, they're basically fully developed, and 14-year-olds, you still have, in the 14 under, you still have kids who are 12 a month ago, who just turned 13. And so, you can serve 130 miles an hour against a kid who was 12 a week ago. And, which is unfair. Basically, Chase is just walking through a tournament, sees Bowen playing in 14 under. His opponent's coaches are on the court arguing with the referees about how this kid clearly isn't 14. And Bowen turns to Chase and asks him to basically cover for him. And he has to make a really tough decision in that point because while he knows sort of where all the difficulties Bowen's had to deal with growing up, at the same time, everyone else in the tournament has also had a lot of difficulties to face, and it's this question of what's the right thing to do, and having grown up in a sort of society where we view things as sportsmanship being the top, being something we really cherish. We give awards of sportsmanship every tournament, and where you're told that the cheating or lying about your age is just something that totally unforgivable. But reconciling that with the idea that Bowen is doing this from a survival standpoint, and so he in some way he sort of doesn't have the luxury of right and wrong that we have here. And so this passage is just from this is the night after he's run into Bowen and had to make that decision. That night, as I lay in bed, I went over and over what I had done and what I had not done. Lines of thought converged, crossed, and doubled back. I tried to convince myself that I had acted correctly. I tried to tell myself that I had done a sensible thing this time, that it was unfair for Bowen to lie about his age, and that enabling his lies would only serve to hurt both of us in the long term. That it was unfair of him to pull me into this. I came up with every possible argument to convince myself that what I had done was right. But no matter what I told myself, there was one thought I could not avoid. My friend had needed my help, and I turned away. I knew what the consequences of my decision were. I knew that if Bowen were caught lying about his age, he would lose his scholarship and any chance he had at making it as a pro. Bowen had never had anyone help me in the way I had. He was trying to survive in a way I had never had to. And yet, even knowing all of that, I had turned away. I knew my father would have agreed with my choice. I thought back to how indifferent he had always been about the futures of Bowen and the rest of my teammates. He had seen more of the hardship in China than I ever had, and if I brought up the unfairness of their situation, I knew he would remind me of the people who had starved during the Great Leap Forward, or of the hundreds of millions of Chinese who still live below the poverty line. He would tell me that for every Bowen I came across, he could point to 10 million young men just like Bowen, in fact, perhaps not even as fortunate as Bowen. Maybe my father had seen so much of it that he had become numb, the way a journalist in a war zone can leave a child stranded by the side of the road and not see it as his duty to do something. Or maybe in the singular pursuit of goals, he had learned to keep emotions quarantined from reason. Or maybe he just understood the unfair algebra of life's opportunities. Thank you. I'm dying. But I wasn't like him. I couldn't ignore what I had seen, and that night, as I tried to fall asleep, I felt the return of the horrible guilt that I'd last felt in the weeks after my brother had passed away. When I showed up for my match the next day, Bowen's name had been crossed off the tennis drawer. So that for me is one of sort of the central questions of the book. What do you do when how far does loyalty to a friend extend, and what you should do when your friend's done something that contradict the values you've been brought up with, and I'd leave it sort of ambiguous whether or not the decision that narrator took was the right one, and I think it's a question I personally don't know what the right answer is, but for me that's one of the things about growing up is that when you're young you think about right and wrong and good and bad and things are very clear, but as you get older you realize that there's a lot of situations that exist in the gray area in between, and that that the world operates in more sort of complex circles than you thought. So yeah, happy to answer any questions if anyone has any.
When you went to school over there, you were studying academic subjects as well as fine arts?
So I basically did I moved to the United States when I was 12, and because the English school system started a year earlier, I was a year younger than everyone else in my grade. So before going off to high school, my parents wanted me to take a year out of school so I got back with the right age group. And at that time, my dad was teaching at a university in China. So I spent that year, basically, I was playing tennis in the afternoons and doing language courses in the morning. So I wouldn't have been able to go into the Chinese school system at that point. I didn't know enough Chinese, or it's a very rigorous system. So.
But you did ultimately go into the Chinese education system?
I was in the sports system, but not in the school system. Although I visited a ton of schools.
Folks, let me get to you with a mic so they can hear you.
Do you have a favorite author or novel? I'm just curious, like, what do you read? What do you like?
Yeah, I've lots, but it's always tough to pick your absolute favorite one. But right now, I'd say I really love Shadow Country by Peter Matheson. It's big. It's like 1,000 pages. It's very intimidating to read. I put it off for several years, but then I finally tried it, and it's absolutely amazing. It's set in the Florida Everglades, and yeah, absolute masterful writer. I think he's maybe the only writer to win National Book Award for fiction and nonfiction. So I definitely recommend that if anyone's looking for an 1,000-page book to start on. Light summer read.
Why the name Chase?
Well, I think this is like a bit where it gets into the difference between fiction and memoir. The narrator in the book does a lot of, he's doing the same stuff that I was doing in China, but he's also a character, and he's different from, his background and stuff is very different to mine. I'd never had a older brother who passed away like he does, and this is a kid who's basically spent his whole life in, growing up in a wealthy area in Connecticut. And I knew lots of kids like that at my boarding school. And so when I wrote this, I kind of wanted to write, trying to imagine what if one of these lacrosse players I know from Greenwich was doing what I did. And a lot of them are called Chase, so.
Bravo, JR. My question is around how easy is it or hard is it to fake your birth date, even in the United States or in China? I imagine that it would be a really hard thing to do. I mean, there's data, there's records, there's people who have. Is this? You say that it's pretty rampant. It goes on all the time, but is it something that's?
I think it's a lot easier than you'd think. I think. Even in the U.S., there'd be rumors about certain kids that they'd been 11 3 years ago and they were still 11 somehow, which is. Well, first of all, if you if let's say you move here when you're however old, you can be homeschooled from age 5 to 8, and all of a sudden you show up at a tennis tournament, and the USTA doesn't require you to give your birth certificate. They just sort of take it at face value. ITF, which is a 18 and under international circuit, you have to give a passport. But I mean, I'm not sure. My guess is that most of my teammates in China probably had fake birth certificates, which, you know, corruption's very rampant in China, especially less so now than it was then. But I don't. And also, I mean, this was 2004, 2005, I guess I was over there. So, you know, a lot of the like technology we have on documents and stuff didn't exist. And I'm sure a lot of these were just documents like that were they're probably just handwritten on forms and stamped by someone, and that's it. So I feel like if you really want to come up with fake documentation, you can't. And that's only going to be checked in certain circumstances. And also, how's the guy in the ITF office going to know what's a real Chinese birth certificate and what's a fake one?
And your parents have to be on board with it.
The parents are usually the ones who sort of come up with the idea to do it.
I'm interested to know, we're all brought up to have honor and integrity, at least if we have parents of that sort, and it matters a great deal because you don't want to lose it ever. So what is the situation in China? Are people brought up? I know there are different levels. The aristocrats will do one thing, maybe the people who have nothing another. But what is the story there about being honest and truthful and having integrity?
So, kind of an interesting thing was when this book came out in China, I went to, I think, 11 different schools, high schools, middle schools, 1 or 2 colleges, and just talked to students about the book, about writing. And a lot of them asked me why the narrator didn't help Bowen in the end. And they said their view is basically they totally understood why Bowen was lying about his age, and were like, look, the guy had nothing, he came from nothing. This kid who has so much should be helping him out. And to me, that speaks, it's a cultural difference, I think, where here we take the opposite approach. I've had the exact same question, like exact same amount of outrage, but why would he be doing this in the first place? And I think what we kind of forget is that in some way being able to have those standards is a luxury. That if you grow, you know, that's a society where for 10 years people didn't know if they were going to be able to eat that day, and people had to eat the bark off trees to survive. And so when there was food, you know, people didn't stand in line, because if you stood in line and waited, then maybe you didn't get anything to eat. And so things like that we take for granted are almost like blessings of a really privileged society in a way. And so I think my point was just that I think you have to understand that the way that we think about things here, that the way you're brought up, whatever values you're brought up with, don't translate ever across the world, and it requires a certain amount of flexibility to sort of be able to empathize with someone in that.
How do you feel about China? I mean, do you feel at home when you go there? I mean, do you have deep emotion? Do you love it there? Personally?
I wouldn't say that I feel at home there. You know, I spent a year there when I was 14, and I was back there for 6 months. It was about a year and a half ago, and I'll be there again for a year. But also, I don't necessarily think of like anywhere as home. I lived in the UK till I was 12, then I moved here, went to boarding school, I lived in China. I've spent a lot of time in Florida. I honestly think of Florida as being like the closest place to home for me, just because I was playing tennis here most of my summers and stuff ever since I was 11. So I wouldn't say I think of it. I feel at home there, and it's definitely a very. I mean, it's totally totally different to area I grew up in and stuff like that. But I find it such an interesting place. I think it's a place that's changing so rapidly, and there's so much going on there that I think like sort of situations like that bring out. It's an interesting thing to write about because there's just so much going on, and everyone's trying to figure out how they fit into this new China that's developing. So.
How hard did you say it is to write a book? I mean, you were very young when you wrote it. Obviously, you have many years in your life ahead to write many novels. Is this something you do again? Or was it, did you find it fun? Did you find it like overwhelming?
I think if I hadn't had this like structure where I just had to turn in a chapter every month, I never would have finished it. Because it's like a really daunting task at first, and it would be something I'd probably gotten 40 pages into it and had gotten busy with finals and just never gone back to it. And but I really needed the A's. No, but I really enjoy the writing part of it. I don't like the revision part so much, but I find the like writing stories and stuff is just. I used to read so much when I was little. I think it's just natural that I'd want to do that at some point. But the revision is really the tough part because you have to go back to something you've looked at 300 times and reread it and change the same sentence again and again. And I used to hate doing that with essays in school. So this is like that times 10.
I read that today there are many fewer editors. There used to be wonderful editors like Maxwell Parrish. I mean, did you have an editor to work with?
Yeah, I was lucky enough to get a really great editor at HarperCollins, who really sort of thought about the book the way I did, and I think that's the most important thing is that they don't try to turn it into something it's not, and they don't try to sort of fit it. I think if you take a story and you try to sort of cram it into this idea that you have of a story, or adapt it slightly so that instead of being a literary fiction book, now it's a spy novel or something. Like if you do that, then the core of it goes out the window, and that's really bad. So I really was glad that she thought about it in the same way, and she didn't want to change the tone of it or the aesthetic or anything. But yeah, it's kind of interesting because I was talking to my writing teacher at Harvard about people like Maxwell Perkins and Gordon Lish and stuff like that who like develop these relationships with writers over the course of their careers and kind of guide them and all that. And he sort of, for him, that's not very important. And he just wants an editor who's going to have his back and like be there throughout the publishing process and make sure that the company follows through on the promises they make to him and all that. But I do kind of like the idea of having like a relationship with someone over the course of 20, 30 years where like they know your work well and they're almost like a coach or a mentor in a way. So I feel like those people are definitely still out there, probably just not as well known yet.
Well, I have a question. If you were to choose another career other than writing, if that is your chosen career, with all this experience you've had at such a young age, the traveling and all the different cultural impacts that you've experienced, would there be something other than this that you would want to focus on, or is it too early to tell?
Yeah, I'm not really sure, to be honest. I think there's a lot of things I'm interested in, and I want to keep writing, but I don't think you have to only do that, and so I don't know, keeping my options open, and we'll see what happens.
Because I want you to keep writing. If this is your debut novel, I can't wait to see what's coming after. Does anyone else have any other questions? All right. Well, that was remarkable. Thank you so much, PR, for that. Folks, again, watching online, give us a call. We'll get a book signed for you, and we'll ship it to you. For those of you here, of course, the books are for sale behind the counter. Jar will be sitting right over here to sign the books for you. Enjoy the rest of your food. We got some live music coming up in the courtyard. Stick around, make a night here at Books and Books. Thank you so much for joining us.